The 1990s is largely considered to be a lost decade for Bruce Springsteen. In addition to being his least prolific decade, he only released 3 studio albums in the 1990s. It's also probably his least inspired decade, with him sifting through old veins of inspiration in search of a new creative spark. Those include his romantic challenges, which he explored in great depth and to great success on Tunnel of Love, people struggling through the underbelly of late-stage capitalism, which is a near constant feature of his writing, people straddling the worlds of moral rectitude and moral turpitude, which is particularly present on Nebraska, and much more. He spent the first 2 decades of his career establishing himself as both an artist and as a man. Yes, he went from total obscurity in the early 1970s to one of the world's biggest celebrities by the end of the 1980s. But more deeply, he shattered the constraints that most people are subject to, especially the people he grew up with. Financial constraints, geographic constraints, professional constraints, romantic constraints. For most artists, those obstacles are what make them great, the gargantuan forces of oppression that it takes an even more gargantuan strength to overcome. So, by the 1990s, the question for Bruce Springsteen became, now what? To quote Better Days from 1992's Lucky Town, how will he proceed as a rich man in a poor man's shirt? Let's find out. Again, I've selected some of my favorite comments from the 1980s video to respond to at the end of this one, from the insightful to the vengeful, so stick around to see if your comment got selected. I do recommend watching the 1970s and 80s installments before this because the narrative of his career is equally as interesting as the analysis of individual albums. Lastly, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to my page for more music analysis, original music, and more. Okay, Bruce Springsteen 1990s studio album tier list. Let's go. 9. Human Touch. This album is generally considered to be Springsteen's worst studio album. The reality with this album is that most of the music is sort of just not that memorable. My hypothesis on why I think that's the case is that almost without exception, the first 8 albums of Springsteen's career, the concept, if you will, is different album to album. The same cannot be said for Human Touch. A lot of these songs sound like they could or should have been on a previous Springsteen album, but they don't feel like they have a unique position on a new Springsteen album. The Human Touch, the song, sounds like an outtake from the Tunnel of Love sessions. Soul Driver is the same. 57 channels and nothing on. It's as if he took the production approach to Nebraska and instead of using a 4-track recorder, used a professional studio. But it doesn't really feel of a kind with anything else on the album. It feels very much like an outlier. I think Springsteen's question in these years is, what is the next beast that I need to oppose with the strength of my artistry? The answer that he goes with here, which is kind of an underwhelming answer, is beasts that I've already defeated. The turmoil he faces in the midst of a committed romantic relationship is the primary one here. And again, it feels a little redundant in the context of Tunnel of Love. In essence, I like the title track, but my main gripe with it is there's no way it has to be a 6.5-minute song. There's no way. Especially as the first song in the album. Like, it kind of sets you up for what the rest of the album is, which is a too long piece of work about the same thing he just wrote about 6 years ago, 5 years ago. The other context here is he released this album on the same day in 1992 as Lucky Town, another full album's worth of songs. The decision to release 2 albums at once probably made sense in the context of where he was at this point. He hadn't released an album of original music since Tunnel of Love in 1987, so it had been 5 years. So maybe he felt like his audience was ready for a larger than normal allotment of new original songs. Looking at it in retrospect without that context that I would listen in, I just disagree. From a purely artistic perspective, I don't think that release approach, that album structuring approach was the correct one. And, it's kind of the first time in Springsteen's career that I feel that way. I think it was correct to make The River a double album. I think it was correct to not make Nebraska and Born in the USA a single album, which he was thinking of doing. I think it was correct to make a real stylistic left turn after Born in the USA and not just try to make another Born in the USA. At this point, I think this was wrong. This was an incorrect step, and it yields a couple of inferior albums. There are probably 4 or 5 songs here that I think are good enough to listen to more than just one time. And that's kind of it. I would say this is the inaugural entry in Springsteen's D tier. 10. Lucky Town. Lucky Town is generally considered to be the superior of the two albums, and I agree with that, if only because it's the shorter of the two albums. On balance, I don't think it's any more inspired than Human Touch is. The difference probably between Human Touch and this one is that this one has songs that will periodically pop into my head. The song Better Days is actually very well written. There's some really fascinating lyrical turns in there. And I think the song Better Days really encapsulates the dilemma that Springsteen finds himself in the early 1990s. And the refrain, the These Are Better Days refrain, has both joyousness and grief in it. This is what I set up my career to get, and now I've got it. I both have a new purpose in my family, but I maybe have sacrificed that for purpose in my creative life, in my artistic life, or at least I don't have the old one, and I wonder if I'll find a new one. This album is kind of the beginning of a songwriting tendency in the latter portion of Springsteen's career, which I think yields uninspired songs. The example I'll give is Leap of Faith. Yes, it takes a leap of faith to enter into a romance, into any kind of long-term commitment. It's the kind of message you might hear from a preacher in church. What I think a lot of people mean when they say Springsteen songs get preachy at times is that they have a distinct moral or political point of view, which that doesn't bother me at all. What bothers me from an aesthetic point of view is when the core of the song is something you could read in a Hallmark card. It's also kind of a cliche. The term leap of faith, he didn't come up with that term. The idea that he's expressing in that song is not an original idea, it's a reiteration of a truism. Those are not things that I go to art for. Better Days is not a term he came up with, but he is casting it in this sort of ironic context of These Are Better Days, which I'm thrilled about on one level and a little bit grieving on another level. I would say roughly the same thing about Living Proof, about Book of Dreams, Souls of the Departed, and My Beautiful Reward. Living Proof is a beautiful song in the sense that it's a really impassioned song about the birth of his first child. It's a musically very uninteresting song. I find the vocal kind of strained. The difference between the validity of the motive of writing the song and the effectiveness of the execution of the song, good intentions do not a good song make. You've got about 3 or 4 songs here that are intrinsically fun and rewarding to listen to. You've got about that much on Human Touch. Altogether, I think you would wind up with kind of a B or B plus type of album. I don't think you wind up with a masterpiece, if only because all of the subject matter is subject matter that he's explored already in much greater depth and to much greater effectiveness. With the two albums together in the form that they're in, what you kind of get instead is perhaps an unintentionally effective depiction of an artist casting about for new inspiration, releasing too much material that resonates too little, hoping maybe that the volume of the material will account for its missing inspiration. And yeah, ultimately a couple of albums that in and of themselves are underwhelming. There is a lot that I enjoy on Lucky Town, and some of it that I enjoy on a deep level. But ultimately this album, like Human Touch, is in and of itself pretty underwhelming. I would put Lucky Town at the very top of Springsteen's C tier. 11. The Ghost of Tom Joad. This is essentially Nebraska Volume 2. I have such mixed feelings about this album. I've listened to this album in a number of different settings. I listened to it on the train where, there's a sufficient amount of background noise to drown out some of the album's finer points. I've listened to it walking around where I can focus a little bit more, but I don't have a lyric sheet in front of me that I'm reading. And I've listened to it alone in my apartment, looking at and reading the lyric sheet with me the entire time. By far, the most effective way that for me to listen to this album is that last approach, in as quiet as possible a setting, with nothing to distract you, with the lyric sheet open in front of you. The reason you need the lyric sheet open in front of you is because you just cannot discern what he is saying half the time. That's not because the vocal is mixed too low or something, it's just that he's not enunciating. And you can tell that he took pains to write detailed songs. There's a lot of very interesting, novelistic details that are embedded in these songs. Like the travails of the guy in Straight Time, who wrestles so much with the idea of whether or not he can make it on the outside of a prison, or whether he's going to fall back into a life of crime. Or like the two brothers in Sinaloa Cowboys, who go from struggling across the border to cooking meth with fatal consequences for one of them, and what the other brother does in the wake of that. These are interesting stories with interesting characters who are pretty well fleshed out with the details that Springsteen put in the songs. I almost think it would have worked better as a collection of short fiction than as a collection of, sort of quasi-folk songs. The performances are just missing some characteristics that make solo acoustic or very stripped down song settings effective. Number one is you have to enunciate your lyrics. I have to know what you're saying. Another is just that the music is so simple and so samey throughout. At this point in Springsteen's career, you're a little bit starting to worry that he's only got 2 or 3 chord progressions in him anymore. The music song to song is so indistinguishable. Just like it does with Nebraska for me, it results in an album that has very little dynamic variation. There's an abundance of tenderness in these songs. There's an abundance of compassion, of care, of humanity. Springsteen's, political or social statements, if you want to call them that, are not grounded in nebulous ideals. They're not grounded in ideas of, it should be different, without being grounded in flesh and blood people. And this album is another good example of that. He has painstakingly created characters from whose circumstances you can infer political statements or social statements. But, moralizing is not the point of these songs. It's compassion. The point of these songs is to inspire compassion for groups of people who are right up against a conflict to which there is no easy answer, namely the border conflict. He's got songs about people on either side of the border, people who are trying to elude enforcement, people who are trying to enforce without compromising their values. He's got compassion for people on both sides of that dispute, which is illuminating the fact that really they're kind of on the same side. They're both just different players in a conflict that neither of them is responsible for creating, and we should have compassion for both of them. I really appreciate the compassion, the care, the thought, the effort that went into creating these songs. However, I think the execution of these songs is relatively poor. I need him to sing the lyrics he worked so hard on clearly enough that I don't have to invest all of my waking attention in getting them. I need him to cast the songs in a musical context that has a little bit more dynamic variation, musical complexity, so that the songs, resonate with the energy that they're supposed to resonate with. I sort of want him to pare away the songs that are a little bit more general, that are a little bit vaguer in their stories. Like Highway 29 is kind of vague in what happens in that story. Dry Lightning is a little bit vague in terms of what's going on in that. Like, I think pare away some of the songs that don't have that narrative specificity that makes the most effective songs so effective. I feel like a coach, and I mean, far be it for me to tell Bruce Springsteen what to do, but it frustrates me because there is so much I like about this album, and there is also so much that's so apparent to me that's hurting it, that I wish I could have, I wish I could have given him the feedback. I mean, I know that sounds ridiculous, but I do. Cumulatively, I think what I would recommend to people who have not listened to this album before is do it like I did. Give it at least one really hyper-focused listen. Listen to it like I did, alone in your apartment, when you're alert, and with the lyrics in front of you. And you will see and feel the compassion and the heartfelt attention that went into creating these songs. My gripes with how this album was executed are sufficient for me to put it in a relatively low place in Springsteen's studio album tier list. I would put it at the very top of Springsteen's C tier. So there's your 1990s. What I can instantaneously compare it to is Bob Dylan in the 1980s. They're both kind of putting on old garments that don't quite fit like they used to, and then putting on new garments that don't look as hip on them as they do on the hip young kids of the day. Just casting about for new veins of inspiration and largely just missing the mark. What constructively can we take away from that? And when I say we, I'm kind of talking about people like me. Artists who, in my case have not found an extremely broad listenership yet, but, are trying to, and have to kind of operate on the assumption that at some point I will, because why else would you pursue something as likely to not work out as music? So you have to kind of be delusionally optimistic, and I am. And so then assuming that you someday do, how do you prepare yourself for that moment when your previous sources of inspiration in the forms of the forces that were oppressing you previously, when they're gone, when those dissolve? What do you do? I think what you don't want to do is go back to old veins of inspiration and try with those again. I think you don't want to do that. Those are not the most effective Springsteen songs from this decade. The most effective ones are Better Days, which is about his present circumstances, not about his past circumstances. The Ghost of Tom Joad and Youngstown are the two that I take from that album. Maybe 57 Channels and Nothing On. It's about the failed promise of the new abundance of televised media. That's something that would only get exacerbated as those sources of media proliferated over the years. Looking at myself here. Maybe it's just you have to insistently keep it new. You have to coach yourself toward keeping it new and not just rehashing old material. But I would essentially recommend to listeners now trying to get an idea of who Bruce Springsteen is as an artist and how he has reached the different creative pinnacles that he's reached in his life is like just develop an understanding of what went down here in the 90s, but you should not go in expecting to be amazed at any point. And you probably shouldn't go in expecting a lot of music that's going to compel you to revisit it that many times. These are kind of albums you listen to a few times and then think more deeply about the creative heights of Springsteen's career. There is a new creative chapter of Springsteen's career on the horizon, brought on by something that I'm sure he would trade that new creative chapter for 1,000,000 times over. The tragedy, in New York on September 11th, 2001, which I am old enough to remember. Just the way that World War II kind of rejuvenated the U.S. economy, 9/11 kind of rejuvenated Springsteen's writing life. He, more than any of us, perhaps would trade that for the atrocity not having happened. But we have the world we've got, and we've got the Springsteen music we've got, and in the context. And the context in which it was motivated. So on that note, let us now dive into some of your comments on the 1980s video. On the River, Canadian Laser writes, if The River was a single album with the best 12 or 13 songs, it would be his best album and one of the best ever made. Yeah, I don't really agree with this. I see where Canadian Laser is coming from, Canada, but I don't really agree with the point. Part of what makes The River such a special album is its sprawl. There's a narrative reason for that in the context of Springsteen's career. He had built up all this energy and material after not releasing music for so long because of legal disputes, and also just, I think, perpetually feeling on the verge of a giant breakthrough and still having the energy and the hunger of wanting to break through and believing that it was possible. I think there's an argument to be made that the White Album could have been a single album, but the sprawl of the White Album is kind of conceptual, and I think the sprawl of The River is conceptual as well and contributes to my great enjoyment of it. On Nebraska, Todd Birkin writes, without reason to believe, I don't think it would be as strong an album as it is. I think that song nails the theme and pulls it all together. I agree with this completely, and I think it also illuminates something that Springsteen is reliably good at, which is using that last song on the album to tie the whole album together and give you a lens to look at everything that came before it through. Darkness on the Edge of Town is a great example of that. I talked abundantly about that when I was talking about Darkness on the Edge of Town. Jungle Land is a great example of that on Born to Run. My Hometown is a pretty good example of that. Nebraska as an album is essentially about the underbelly of America and the underbelly of capitalism more broadly. Reason to Believe both applauds people for finding a reason to believe and maybe criticizes them a little bit. If there are so many of us who are not benefiting from the system, why do we still believe in it? But on the other hand, what choice do we have but to believe in it? It's a double-edged message that you can superimpose on the rest of the songs on the album, and in doing so appreciate them more. It brings up an important point about endings in general, which is that whether they mean to or not, they always cast a shadow on everything that came before them in the album, in the book, in the film, whatever. A good ending complicates and deepens everything that came before it. A bad ending does just the opposite. On Born in the USA, ewick33 writes, it suffered overexposure for a long time and people sort of underrated it because of it. It became cool to hate it. Definitely. This brings up an interesting point about an art form like popular music, which is that it is by nature supposed chose to kind of be popular. Even the most avant-garde popular music lives if it is sufficiently popular, Bob Dylan being the key example of that. Art in capitalism needs to find a market in order to survive, and in order to survive just beyond the local conditions in which it's first created and performed. And when an album like Born in the USA finds as substantial of a market as it finds, it can feel to any individual listener as less personal or less individually important. As somebody who listens to very little contemporary pop music, I completely sympathize with that point of view. But I do think that the principle that I sort of sign off on is that we should all seek to develop individual relationships with and thoughts on the music that finds its way into our world. Accepting a prevailing opinion as the correct one because it's the prevailing opinion is not good enough in my view. And, as it applies to Born in the USA, dismissing it because of its commercialism or because of its popularity, because of its ubiquity in the mid-1980s is not the right way to treat the album. On Tunnel of Love, TZ Mission 7 writes, I remember not appreciating this as a teenager. Finally got it when I was in my 30s. It's brilliant. And Scott Do Film writes, didn't like this one at all until I became a father. In case you missed them, my thoughts on Tunnel of Love were more or less, I find myself at a very similar juncture to the one Springsteen was at when he wrote and recorded that album. That, alongside these comments, illuminate another interesting nuance of appreciating art, music in general. Your appreciation of a work of art depends so heavily on the moment in your own life in which it first appears to you. I didn't appreciate Tunnel of Love all that much when I was a teenager either, but upon encountering challenges specific to being over the age of 30, I've begun to appreciate it much more deeply. And it sort of pokes a hole in the idea that you can ever have an objectively accurate assessment of art. Your assessment of art is always going to be colored by who you are, where you are in your life when you hear it, and a number of other biases that are impossible to totally extricate from your critical state of mind. The lessons from that, I think, are twofold. One is that none of these assessments is objectively correct, and that it's useful to discuss them because it illuminates other ways of looking at a work of art that deepen our appreciation of it. And additionally, that really great art is that which reveals itself to you in different ways as you age. On the tier list in general, T-Bone76 writes, I see Bruce Inc. is paying people to repair Bruce's image after attacking Trump. If only, if only. YouTube pays me a little bit. I get maybe $150 a month from these videos, but I think the illogic of this comment is funny. Like, this was commented on TikTok, and my profile on TikTok in the scheme of things is practically non-existent. I do have like 2,000 followers, but the only people that really make a living on TikTok are the people who have like millions of followers. It's funny how reflexively people jump to conspiracy theories these days, even without any logical foundation on which to ground those theories. But also, like, Bruce Inc., if you're watching this, I would love for you to pay me for this. Assuming that you're okay with me continuing to be honest about my takes on this work, I would love for you to pay me for this. So Bruce Inc., feel free to get in touch. On criticism in general, Patrick Sexton 3822 writes, when you have written songs of the caliber of the Nebraska album, then and only then you can diss a classic like that album. You are pretentious in your views, etc., etc. It's not that comments like these hurt my feelings. I just think that they have ideas in them that are worth exploring. Like the idea that criticizing something requires having produced work of equivalent value. There's nothing true about that. Whether or not we verbalize it, everyone forms a response to the art that they experience, the music they listen to. And there is value in verbalizing it to yourself. It teaches you what you appreciate about music. If you're also an artist, it teaches you about the kind of artist you do and don't want to be. It teaches you about the inner workings of writing. It teaches you about the inner workings of production. Verbalizing your thoughts is a valuable exercise. At no point am I saying that my views are the only ones that are correct. At no point am I insisting that you share my views. In fact, I'm fascinated when somebody disagrees thoughtfully with me because it deepens my understanding and my experience with the music. I do think it is wrong for a critic to take the point of view that they are correct about something and that nothing else can be correct. I don't think it's wrong for a critic to oppose the prevailing view on something, especially assuming they have a credible foundation on which to oppose it. Constructive criticism is a really healthy endeavor, and I think, like I said in the last video, our world would be a happier place if we could all constructively criticize criticize one another without it devolving into a war. Whether you agree or disagree with my takes on these 90s albums, please let me know in the comments. Additionally, I am sort of approaching the latter stages of Springsteen's career and thinking about what to do next, so if you have, a preference on what to do next, whether it's an artist whose work you'd like to see me analyze in the way that I've analyzed Springsteen and Dylan, let me know about that, or if there's some other concept you'd be interested in seeing me execute. Either way, thank you very much for watching, and I will see you next time.